Welcome to the B Block Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Scott. I appreciate you for joining me, and I'm going to go ahead and just address this part before I even get into the show. Admit to you, if you subscribe to the podcast and you tried to listen to the last podcast that published on this channel, whether it be on the YouTube or wherever it is that you get the audio version of the B Block Podcast, you might have noticed that all you could hear was that wonderful intro that Figgy Fig, the best producer in the entire world, produced for my segment on Sports Radio 610 and ultimately for this podcast. You did not hear me speaking. That was honestly user error, but we are going to revisit, or I am going to revisit, and y'all will, with me at least, visit for the first time some of the same things that I was not able to properly articulate for you in the previous podcast. But I will say, to keep this thing fresh, there have been some things that have happened since the last time I recorded this podcast, and that is, for me right now, this Joe Mixon story. Are y'all following the Joe Mixon story and the fallout and the aftermath of the Texans-Chiefs game? It is kind of incredible to me, and I don't know if it's just because I'm so close to it, because I cover the Texans, because I'm in Houston, because I'm working for the Texans flagship, or what exactly the reason is, or if it's just the fact that this thing is heightened. Maybe it's the fact that it's the Chiefs, and the Chiefs and the narrative around them and how they are officiated did not start with the Texans and likely won't end with this game against the Texans. But there has been a lot of attention paid to how that game was officiated, the divisional game that the Chiefs won against the Texans last Saturday. And now it's fine time. Like, we're in the middle of the week, and it's time for the NFL to start levying and issuing fines to the guys that they feel like were out of pocket or spoke out of turn about the officiating that took place. And Joe Mixon is right now, the face of it, is being made an example out of. But the funny thing about this whole thing is that the league fined him for not initially what he actually said, but for what he did not say. And to me, it is funny, and I'll tell you how this happened, but it is funny to me that the league would show a different kind of incompetence in the midst of the Texans calling them out on something entirely different, right? The Texans are calling out what they consider to be poor officiating, and I would agree with them about the poor officiating. They're going even further and saying that it is even more nefarious and even more insidious, I should say. I kind of stumbled over that word. You have to forgive me. Insidious in the sense that they're doing it for the Chiefs, and that the league, there's like a conspiracy to get Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl and to promote the Chiefs and all of this kind of stuff. And there are others, not just the Texans. There are fans, and there are like credible football people and pundits that are subscribing to this type of nonsense. But that's not even the incompetence that the league shows. That those things are mostly made of emotion, and a lot of it is if we're being honest about it, childish and immaturity, but it's not really real. The league, though, showed a certain level of incompetence right here in this Joe Mixon fine. Now, they corrected themselves, I think, once they got called out by it, or called out for it by Joe Mixon and his agent, and Pro Football Talk wrote about it, and it made its way around social media, and it became a thing on Wednesday that Joe Mixon was fined not for the thing that he actually said after the game, but for a thing that he did not say. What happened was Sports Illustrated wrote an article about Joe Mixon's comments, and apparently in their initial article, there was a misattribution of a quote that actually TJ Houshmandzadeh, the former Bengals wide receiver, actually said that was even, I would say, even more critical of the officials even than what Joe Mixon was. but it was misattributed to Joe Mixon and then cited by the league in their fine of Joe Mixon. He was fined for something that somebody else said that was in line with what he said, but not exactly what he said. Now, what's funny about it also is that what he said was probably something that they could fine him for. And they do go back and correct themselves and say, no, okay, this is what you're fined for. You're fined for what you actually said because we didn't like it either. But the issue here is that the league did not have a better fact finding and vetting process than this for like their information. Like they could have fined Joe Mixon for what he did say, and they ultimately did for what he actually said. But they didn't even have the ability to properly seek out the information. Like that makes you wonder if whoever it is that's levying the fines or making the decisions should be in a position to do so, if this is what their vetting process is. So that's a bad job by the NFL for not actually for just taking Sports Illustrated's word for it and not actually understanding the context of the reporting and the quote and getting some kind of clarification before they levied this fine. And then I would also point out, and I didn't even read this article that Sports Illustrated apparently wrote. I'd imagine that it's been corrected since. And so I don't even know anything about the article for myself, like firsthand. But if this is what happened, I would say this is also really a bad job by the media as well. Like this is poor job by the NFL, poor job by the media specifically. I shouldn't say the media at large, specifically Sports Illustrated, but a media example of how important it is to get your details right, how important it is to get it right early or the first time and not be in a position where you're having to correct it. And I sympathize because I'm in this business and I understand how hard it is to when you're distracted and there's a lot going on. Like I get it, all the excuse making that you can have for why things could fall through the cracks or why there could be some misunderstandings. I am actually myself personally sensitive toward, but it does not lessen the importance of getting shit right. Right. Because apparently the league does not do its own fact finding and doesn't have its own like solid verification process. They see an article on Sports Illustrated and see that you've attributed a quote to Joe Mixon. They're going to take your word for it and just assume that Sports Illustrated got the quote right, which you could make it an excuse for that and say, hey man, that's supposed to be a credible media outlet. If they attribute a quote, that should be real, but also the league should be in a position where they can actually go find what the man said in his media availability. So this is a bad job by both. And I think it's a real sort of like interesting dynamic that we're talking here this late into the week about this game and this officiating and just the fallout of it. Now, we should not be surprised if not only Joe Mixon, but a number of Texans, either players or coaches, get fined for this because they did speak out against the officials publicly, which is, whether you like it or not, against the rules. Like it is not allowed. And to me, I still don't have a problem with speaking out, saying your piece, giving your opinion, and just taking it on the chin. Like you know the rules. And you know that, like the terms of engagement, right? You know, if you go down this rabbit hole, if you go down this alley, that this is what's on the other side for you. That if you criticize the officials publicly or even kind of seem like you're criticizing the officials publicly, you are going to be held accountable by way of a fine. So to me, if you believe it and that's what you got to say, you just got to stand on it, take your fine, take it on the chin, and you got to move on. But this one, to me, is interesting because they got it wrong initially. They didn't even get the information right. They couldn't. It's like framing a guilty man or convicting a robber for the wrong robbery or something of that nature. Like that part of it is, I think, entertaining and funny as you talk about one piece of incompetence, the officiating itself, and then the league and how they levy fines for criticizing this poor officiating. All of that is just hilarious and like laughing and finger pointing at the league for their incompetence. Now, that leads me to why the Texans really lost to the Chiefs. I want to get to that because that's what I actually talked about in the last podcast. That's what I actually went over in the last podcast that you didn't get to hear. But I digress, and I actually get this off my chest. You might have heard me talk a little bit about this already on Sports Radio 610, where I appear in the loop every Tuesday at 11 a.m. I'm on for an hour. Reginald Adatula and John Lopez and Figgy Fig talked about this a little bit, but we didn't have our full hour because of the snow and the weather and the road closures and all of that kind of stuff in Houston. So I didn't actually get to go in for my full hour. Just did my hit over the phone for about 10 minutes, but normally that's a full hour. And of course, on Wednesdays, I'm on the drive with Clint Sterner and Ron Hughley. So if you listen to that, you probably already heard some of this, but I want to just get this out there because it is such a, like it's such a visceral reaction to this game. And just this conversation just seems so pervasive. I don't know how I just don't weigh in on the podcast. I don't think that this, like, it wasn't the refs, and there is no conspiracy, I think, against the Texans and in favor of the Chiefs. Like, it was not the refs that lost the Texans this game, and there certainly is not a conspiracy in favor of the Chiefs or against the Texans or any combination of those two things. I do think that there is something to wanting the best stories and the most compelling television products on the field. And right now, I think that the Chiefs chasing their third Super Bowl with a generational quarterback and a coach who's also a generational coach, I think those are more compelling television stories than, say, the upstart Texans. Like, to me, I would even say that's an objective reality, that the Chiefs right now in their story arc is a more compelling storyline and a more compelling television product than the Texans. I think that's okay. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just don't think that the game is actually officiated that way or necessarily with that in mind. I don't think that they're unaware of it when they're out there, but I don't think that they're officiating the game in that way. I think there's a lot of hoping and wishing on the league's part that the game plays out a certain way, that they do get, say, Chiefs and Bills or Chiefs and Ravens, and they're going to get Chiefs Bills instead of, say, Texans and the other side. But I don't think they go as far as to officiate the game to sway it that way. It's not wrestling. It's not scripted. I think we understand that. Now, if you've got a gambling conspiracy, like maybe you want to tell me that one of the refs is fixing games for betting purposes, then I'll hear that. Like, or maybe a ref is actually a closet Chiefs fan, I'll hear that. If you want to tell me that this is like personal for somebody that's officiating the game in some type of way, I'll hear you on that. But I haven't heard that. That's not out there, and I don't have anything to base that on. I don't have anything to base a conspiracy theory on other than just the understanding that the league likely prefers the more compelling television storyline, even though it is a league that essentially cannot fail, doesn't matter who they put out there. They want the Chiefs in the AFC Championship game. That much is for sure. I just don't think they want it so bad that they would compromise the entire game and officiate it in that way. So, I think the league wants the Chiefs in there, but it stops short of fixing the games. It's more of a hope and a prayer more than anything. But I think the Texans actually lost to the Chiefs because they didn't take care of business when they had the chances to. I mean, that's what this ultimately came down to. The Texans having opportunities to, even despite some poor officiating and some calls that went against them, even despite some plays that they didn't make or some plays that the Chiefs did make that went against the Texans, they had opportunities to respond, to fight fire with fire, which is ultimately what you have to do when you get to this point of the season if you want to advance. And the Texans did not do that. That is what this came down to. Like the Chiefs get a field goal on that bogus Will Anderson Jr. penalty early in the game. Then the Texans respond with a drive that ends with a sack that the rookie Blake Fisher inexcusably is assigned one-on-one with Chris Jones on the edge. Like, and of course, we know that Chris Jones, they'll line up anywhere on the defensive line, and he's likely a mismatch against pretty much anybody. But that's a drive-killing sack when Chris Jones beats Blake Fisher on the right side, and that's how you responded to ultimately your defense kind of really holding up after that bad call, right? Like you get the bad call and you still hold up with a field goal against the Chiefs. And I think, honestly, holding the Chiefs to field goals in the postseason, like to me, that's, and especially after a call like that, that's a victory. That's a tip of the cap to the defense for holding it down. And then you got to go and respond and go get a touchdown or at least score. And they don't do that. They don't do that. And that's not the ref's fault. And honestly, that's not even Blake Fisher's fault. I don't know what that was about. I don't understand. That's just Chris Jones wrecking shop. But you got to help the rookie out a little bit more than that. And I wish they had. But they didn't. And that contributed more, them not responding on that drive and other drives when they didn't respond, when they didn't score touchdowns. That contributed more to the loss than a singular call. Then you look at the penalty against Henry To'oTo'o later in the game. I think that's far worse because that is Patrick Mahomes exploiting the rules. And I know Seth Payne's talked about this on 610. A lot of people have talked about this across media circles, that Patrick Mahomes, the way I characterize it, is got a little bit of con artist in him in terms of baiting the officials into making calls that they probably wouldn't normally make or wouldn't normally be made if he didn't intentionally bait it. You know, and we saw him try to do it even later in that drive, and it didn't work, where he stops at the sideline and kind of just waits for him to get pushed out and then flops and says, hey, I got hit late. But he clearly wasn't going out of bounds. He was clearly baiting the hit, and he didn't fall for it. But that was exactly what he did on the penalty against Henry To'oTo'o later in the game. And I thought that one was worse. And it did help the Chiefs extend their drive. Like they actually got the 3 points on that Will Anderson Jr. On the Will Anderson Jr. penalty. And this one helps them extend their drive. But to me, it's a worse penalty, the way it was called, but it was even less consequential to me, even though it was later in the game and they scored a touchdown. Because without that penalty, it would have still been something like 2nd and 6, and they were already moving the ball, and they continued to move the ball after that. But before that penalty, on that play itself, with Mahomes getting a couple of yards on the scramble, and then everything after that play was the Chiefs moving the ball for as well as the defense has played throughout the season at times. And for as well as they played early in this game, that was not an example of it. They got a few examples of them not living up to the moment or meeting the moment, and this was one of them, right? So give a better defensive effort overall on that drive, and we're having a different conversation. And again, you can't tell me that the Chiefs on 2nd and 6 without that penalty, it would have been something like that, 2nd and 7, 2nd and 6. You got about 3 or 4 yards on the scramble. You can't tell me that the Chiefs can't overcome that. All right, that the Chiefs are somehow, that you got them dead to rights. You got them right where you want them. You can tell me that on the Will Anderson Jr. play because they would have been punting. I get that. Like that's a swing. You go from punting to a fresh set of downs, and then you go down and get a field goal. That is gifting them 3 points in a sense. But the way I also look at that again is that the Texans defense did a good job of just holding them to 3 points. You got to go and respond in kind. You got to go and fight fire with fire. They did not do that. So fight fire with fire. Give a better defensive effort, even after you get that bogus penalty on Henry To'oTo'o, and we're having a different conversation. The Texans lost that game because of poor pass protection and not properly covering Travis Kelce. Because for whatever reason, their game plan dictated that covering Travis Kelce was either optional or just not that important. And I don't know how the Texans arrived at that place, but that ain't good. As was evidenced in that game. They lost because of poor pass protection across the board. I think you can point to an example where pretty much everyone on that offensive line at some point got beat. And they had some moments where they played pretty well. But Shaq Mason, possibly his worst, the worst game that we've seen from him, and it certainly wasn't good. Titus Howard had some moments that were not good. I mentioned the Blake Fisher moment against Chris Jones, which again I don't kill the rookie for, but it did happen. That contributed more. I think if they protect Stroud better and actually cover Travis Kelce or actually put some kind of priority on it, make it an obvious part of their game plan, like based on how they play, I can't even imagine what the game plan must have been for Travis Kelce. I can't even imagine what they must have talked about in practice in preparing for this game. Like, did they acknowledge that even though he is a diminished version of Travis Kelce, that he still be Travis Kelce? And this is the playoffs we're talking about. Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, the greatest duo in playoff history, certainly in the modern NFL, in like today in today's NFL. Like I cannot imagine what their plan must have been. And then I didn't even get to special teams. If they do those two things that I mentioned, protect CJ Stroud, actually cover Travis Kelce, and then play better on special teams, which you might say is the biggest thing that killed them, giving up that big play to start the game, like said go, not making field goals, not making extra points, a bad punt late in the game, the penalty on the first play of the game on top of that. Like those things, gifting Patrick Mahomes of all people field position, better special teams, better protection up front, an actual plan to cover Travis Kelce. These are the things that you needed to win this game that I think cost you this game more than anything. As egregious as the calls were. And the NFL does have to look at that more so than this conspiracy theory that we got about them having something in for the Texans or having a hard on for the Chiefs. I think it's more so the issue is in an effort to protect quarterbacks and to enhance offense, they are making calls that are Bush League, that make a mockery of the game and specifically make a mockery of defense and make it so that defensive players are playing with one hand tied behind their back, having to second guess themselves a little bit more than they should. Like set the rules, set the standards, have like fundamentals of how you teach tackling and what's appropriate and what's not, but officiate the game and legislate the game in such a way that accounts for the physicality of it and for the responsibility of the defensive player to impose said physicality on the offense. And both sides are trying to do it, right? You're trying to outman the other. You're trying to out physical the other. That's what the game ultimately is about, right? You can talk scheme, you can talk X's and O's, mono, but it comes down to mano y mano. It comes down to who can force their will over the other is what usually football comes down to, for the most part, what it comes down to. And if you orchestrate it in a way that the defense cannot be as physical as the offense, then that is not fair. So I think they got to look at that. And that's even bigger than this game. That's bigger than the Texans. That's about the game itself, the entire game itself. But officiating is not the reason why the Texans lost this game. I want to mention here where I think the Texans go from here. I think if for me, I would start with check out Texans Cap on Twitter, at Texans Cap on Twitter. That's Troy Chapman, who does salary cap stuff, but also does some pretty good, I think, in-season X's and O's, film study, really good sound commentary. None of it is hot takey. It's just like logic and reason, and it's smart. But Texans Cap has an article out that focuses on the Texans priorities, their offseason priorities, and one of the more recent ones, this should be on his feed from the last couple of days or so, it is focusing on the offensive line and the decisions that they got to make on the offensive line. And they really got to figure this out. What is this going to look like? And I think that they've got to understand that this is the evolution that the team needs. The offensive line is the evolution that this Texans team needs. Last year, it was adding a weapon. It was getting a bona fide number one running back. It was shoring up the defensive line. It was bringing in Daniil Hunter. It was adding all of that depth that they did on the interior of the defensive line or just across the defensive line. This year, when you talk about where the Texans go from here, it is about reimagining the offensive line. It is about making some tough decisions, and it is about really turning this team into what I was just talking about, really turning this team into one that imposes its will on others. It's about turning this team into one that imposes its will on others. I was talking about this on the drive earlier, and my hit got cut early, man. It sucked because apparently my reception was bad. But I'll say it here, man. Rather than trying to game plan around mismatches, every week we hear this, how the Texans are game planning around their mismatches or how they're trying to figure out if they've got the personnel to properly handle stunts and blitzes. And again, these mismatches. Look, you've got to turn into the team that's creating the mismatches, that the other team is having to account for. How do I go up against this guy? Where can I find a weakness where there is none? They don't have that. They've got to become the team that's not always adjusting to the matchup, but becoming the matchup problem. And so I think ultimately the way this ends up working is you keep Laramie Tunsil, and I think obviously you just drafted Blake Fisher, and he's probably your right tackle next year. And this is what Texans Cap gets into. It's time to start having some tough conversations about Titus Howard and what his role with this team looks like, what the investment in Titus Howard looks like. And I think an obvious thing to do is going to be to part ways with Shaq Mason respectfully, for as much as I think he's meant to this team in terms of the leadership. He's not a name that you hear a lot. People talk a lot about, but that's a dude that has a lot of respect and I think carries a lot of weight in that locker room for the things that he had accomplished well before he got to Houston. And he has accomplished a lot well before he got to Houston. He was solid for him last year, their most consistent, or at least their most reliable offensive lineman in his first season with the Texans in 2023. But this past season was a significant drop-off. Texans Cap also points out that Mason has kind of steadily, I would say steadily dropped off since 2021. And that really showed itself this past season here. And look, it was a question when they made the decision to even go with him instead of just sticking with the offensive line that had been working the previous few weeks with Juice Scruggs inserted into the lineup, being their right guard. Why go with Shaq Mason, especially since he struggled and now he's injured on top of it, has shown some mobility issues. Like, I think those were fair criticisms to have at the time. And we can continue to talk like that can continue to be a criticism of the coaching staff or of their decision making if you want it to be. But I think now you got to move on from that. And ultimately, you got to move on from Shaq Mason. It saves you money, and it gives you an opportunity to go ahead and upgrade at this position that is clearly a weakness for you and that you sorely need to upgrade. So to me, the biggest priorities and where the Texans go from here is how they attack the guard position specifically. And I think that means and just an obvious and clear move of parting ways with Shaq Mason. and then a little bit more of a nuanced conversation with Titus Howard, right? I like the idea of Titus Howard competing at right tackle and or guard and being available to play both, but they are going to have to approach him with some conversation of reduction in salary, because now he like it's okay to acknowledge that contract has not projected or has not worked out as projected, right? Like I think that it is okay to just acknowledge that and still try to figure out a way to get the most of Titus Howard and still be fair to him. Like it's obvious he is being paid like an above average tackle, but when he played tackle, he did not give you above average play. And then he had the flexibility, to his credit, to move over to guard, but even at guard gave you probably replacement level play. And so there's some value in a guy that's got flexibility and can play multiple positions for you, but how valuable is that if he doesn't play any of them at a particularly high level? And so that's got to be the evolution of Titus Howard. If he's going to be a part of the plans going forward, we need, whether you're playing right tackle or left guard, it's got to be a little bit better than it was. And I think he knows that. I got to talk to him in the locker room. And look, it wasn't as harsh as it wasn't as harsh as it is right here, as it sounds right here. But Titus is, I think, maybe a little bit more self-aware than he's given credit for, and sounded like he was much more open to, where he hasn't been in the past, I think, or less so in the past, much more open to playing wherever it is that they want him to play or where they need him to play, and also upping his game wherever that's at. You know, like this, and maybe you could benefit, maybe he could benefit from an offseason where the expectation is that he train at left guard and really hone in on becoming a better left guard. And maybe that's your plan there. Maybe that's a better plan than anything that you've had so far. But for me, from where I sit right now, based on how things went, those two positions got to be priorities that you're looking to upgrade, whether it's through the draft, free agency, through a trade, whatever it is. You know, I like Jared Patterson competing at center and guard and being available to play those positions. But I think the Texans need to be prioritizing both guard positions and even center in this draft and free agency process. Maybe Jared Patterson's your center, but the way trading for Joe Mixon and Stephon Diggs was a priority, the way these contract extensions that we've seen for guys like Nico Collins, the offensive lineman, and others, the way that was a priority, the way signing Daniil Hunter was a priority, the way trading picks to draft Will Anderson Jr. was a priority, the way that drafting C.J. Stroud was a priority, the way that hiring DeMeco Ryans was a priority. I think that this is that vital to the Texans taking that next step and getting to where it is that they want to be, prioritizing these guard positions primarily, and even center to a certain degree. Like, we can talk through the offseason about the Texans adding weapons, skill position players, and their free agents on the defensive line. They got a few of those. They have some important moves to make, I think, in that area. But I think you have to feel pretty good and pretty comfortable about the defense based on how it's performed overall in these past 2 years under DeMeco Ryans. It hasn't been perfect, but it's been pretty damn good, I would say. And there are also, a couple of guys that are up for contracts that I think is going to be a big offseason conversation. We'll see what that's looking like. A couple of the 2021 guys got paid, right? Nico Collins, Davis Mills, both got contract extensions from that 2021 class when they became eligible. Now you've got Derek Stingley Jr., Jalen Petrie. Christian Harris is a curious case because he either wasn't healthy or available for much of the season, and it was kind of a lost year for him. But these are guys who are eligible at least for extensions. Damian Pierce and John Mechie, I think, are probably in a little bit of a different conversation, but now you're looking at that draft class to see how you're investing in them in the future, and what is that going to look like? Are you prioritizing that while also trying to put the adequate pieces around those players, right? Like, to me, it just shows how precious these early years are. We're already now about to go into year 3 with CJ Stroud and Will Anderson. They'll be eligible for extensions a year from now. We can talk about all of that in the coming months, and I'm sure that we will. But for me, the big priority, as important as everything that I just mentioned is, the priority remains getting this offensive line to be one that allows the Texans to impose their will on other teams. They are a good team. They are a nice team. They are a fun team to watch and talk about. But way too often, again, we're talking about how the Texans struggle with the blitzes and struggle with the stunts and struggle with these one-on-one matchups, and they got a game plan around these matchups. That's got to be done. That's got to be done. And it starts with making sure your left guard, your center, and your right guard are kicking ass, and that Blake Fisher is ready to put those big boy pants on in year 2 if that's going to be your right tackle and not Titus Howard. And then Titus Howard should be available to you as well, depending on how that conversation goes. But you absolutely got to go to him with a conversation about reducing that salary that does not reflect him being one of the top tackles in the league, and closer reflects to him being a soldier and somebody who is willing and able to do whatever it is that they ask of him. And I do think that there's some value in that. That is worth respecting. And unless they decide to let him go, right? And that's another road that I think you're at least going to have to go down this offseason. That possibility that the Howard contract just doesn't quite work out the way that you wanted it to, or the way that you thought it would. And if they can come up with a contract restructure that everyone feels good about, I'm all for having Titus Howard available to play basically whatever position. Fine with that. So that's where the Texans go from here. I mentioned some other things that I think we can talk about, and I think we will talk about, that will be fun to discuss. But that is the priority. That is what is lacking and what is needed for them to go from here to there. I wanted to get into this too, because I saw that, look, the Titans, I think, are probably drafting Shedeur Sanders. If I were, a betting man, if I were to want to put money on it, I don't know what the prop bets, I don't know what you could win on that. I don't know nothing about that. I'm just saying, if I was, that's where my money would be. And that's because their president of football ops was already on local radio out there in Nashville talking about meeting with Shedeur Sanders at the East-West Shrine Bowl, which is about a week, about a week from now, eight days or so from now. And so I think that's going to be worth watching. I'm not an all-star game guy for really any football, but certainly not college. But the East-West Shrine Bowl might be something that I'm tapping into, that I'm at least following, if not the game itself, certainly the coverage around it and what's being reported around it. Because I feel like if the Titans don't draft Shedeur Sanders, it's going to be because they either didn't like what they saw from him in that game, or what they learned from him when they met with him at the game, or throughout the process. Otherwise, that's going to be Shedeur Sanders' team next year. I don't see, if you're asking me who I think is probably the best player in the draft, I think Abdul Carter out of Penn State has a case. The edge rusher out of Penn State. I think that Travis Hunter has an obvious case as somebody that can do that can really change the game on both sides of the ball for you. And how often do you get that? So I would probably draft Travis Hunter if it was me. If I ruled the world, if I was in charge, if I was running things for the Titans and I was making the decisions in the best interest of the team, like they like to say, I would probably draft Travis Hunter. But they need a quarterback. And Shedeur Sanders, while to me he doesn't project as necessarily a superstar, I'm not seeing that. I do think he could be good for them. I do think that he would be an upgrade at that position. I can't wait to watch that, man. I'm gonna be honest. I cannot wait to watch that. I think Shedeur could be like a Geno Smith level player. Like I said, I don't necessarily see superstar in him, but he's got an obvious appeal and like an energy about him and a track record, not just the pedigree of being Deion Sanders' son, but the success that he's had. I think that's brought him here. That has led to this conversation. It's not just because he's Deion's son that he's in this position, but I think it's his actual track record and some of the stuff that he put on tape that makes you want to watch him. And so I think about what the Titans have going on. And look, it is really, look, you think the Texans offensive line situation is a mess? Go talk to the Titans. Go talk to the Titans, who really need to figure that out for whatever quarterback it is that they're going to roll out there next year. And that's if they're actually trying to be serious. And that's especially if it's going to be Shedeur Sanders, who, it is, I think, a guy who's not going to be shy about voicing his opinion, about letting it be known if he's not happy or if he feels like things are not meeting the standard. He's got a father that's going to be that way. I think no matter where his father works, that he's going to be that way. And so, look, the Titans, I saw this. The Titans had the worst run blocking grade from Pro Football Focus. They had the worst run blocking grade. And then their pass blocking grade was 8th worst. 8th worst. Now, their tackles aren't terrible, but their interior is probably even worse than what the Texans got going on. And that's not going to cut it. That's not going to cut it. They're going to have to really figure that thing out. They've brought in a new GM. This is where I saw this story, because they were just introducing their new GM. He's got a job in front of them because they behaved like a team that thought it was taking itself seriously going into this season, and they were the only ones that thought they were serious. But yeah, Shedeur Sanders against the Texans twice a year. And we know we can expect the Texans to have a good defensive line as long as DeMeco Ryans is around. Those can be some rough days for Shedeur Sanders, man. Or like he could also have Will Levis type of moments, right? It could go either way. Who knows? Who knows with this rivalry and how things end up playing out. That's why I want to watch it, man. I don't think that the NFL and your football fans at large are eager for or rooting for him, like, to be in the AFC South. I don't think anyone's excited about that. Maybe just me, about Shedeur Sanders being in the AFC South. But I am for sure, as somebody who watches every Texans game and catches the Titans live at least twice a year, and because of the nature of it, follows everything that they do. And also think about I'm visualizing this. Just think about the potential trash talk or rivalry that you could get from Shedeur Sanders and, say, like a Kamari Lassiter. Shedeur Sanders and even Derek Stingley, but more so on the field than in public, because we know that Derek Stingley don't be saying a lot, not in public. But apparently, from what I've heard, is a little bit of a talker or showman on the field, and rightfully so. Shout out to first-year All-Pro Sting. But I think it'd be lit. I think it would be absolutely lit, and I am personally hoping that it happens. I can see it happening, and I'm hoping that it happens. The last thing that I want to get to is Billy Wagner, former Astros closer Billy Wagner, being inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Now, if you know anything about me, or if you've heard me talk about the Baseball Hall of Fame in the past, you know that as big of a baseball fan as I am, I don't really hold, and I'm not trying to be self-righteous about this. I'm just giving you my honest opinion. This is where I stand on it, all right? I don't really hold the Baseball Hall of Fame in that high of a regard. And it's not for me to hold in a higher regard, right? It's not like I'm a fan, but it's for the memorializing of the game, the honoring of the game, and for the players themselves, the people that are inducted into it themselves. And it means a hell of a lot to them. And that matters way more than what I got to say about it. All right. I acknowledge that. But just for me personally, I don't have this big affection for the Hall of Fame, specifically the Baseball Hall of Fame, because it itself is too self-righteous for me. Okay. So as somebody who grew up watching baseball in the 90s and early 2000s, like those are my primitive years, right? That's when I grew up, right? And so I'm acknowledging Billy Wagner because his career aligns exactly with that timeline, with my childhood as an Astros fan, watching the Astros and Billy Wagner basically being a constant for the greater part of my adolescent years, my childhood, my formative years, and my adolescent years. But you cannot really come to me as a child of the 90s and early 2000s and tell me that you got a Hall of Fame that doesn't include Barry Bonds, really for any reason. Steroids be damned. It doesn't include Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens. Okay, so what is it then? What is the Hall of Fame if it doesn't, if the best players that you ever saw play it, the very best players that you ever saw play it aren't in it? So I have a tough time really celebrating the Hall of Fame itself, but I do think that this is cool. And I do want to take an opportunity to celebrate Billy Wagner. I do want to do that because I think that he's worthy of it. Like I mentioned, man, Wagner was with the Astros basically from the time I was 7 or 8 years old until I was like 14. So these are my most formative years watching baseball, watching the Astros from the Dome into what was briefly Enron Field to what we've known to be Minute Maid to now what is either Daikin or Dakin. I still struggle with the actual. I guess I'll just call it the icebox for now. But like he was a mainstay and was a stud for the Astros for a really long time. My biggest memories really of Wagner are just of him being a constant, being steady, always feeling like you were in pretty good hands when you handed him the ball, and it just being like that for years. He's got 1999, which is one of the most dominant seasons ever for a closer. And really, when you look at some of the numbers, it's one of the better pitching performances for a single season overall. But also before that, I want to say was either 97 or 98 was probably and I hate to even do this, but it is the biggest memory that I have of Billy Wagner when they were playing. I think it was the Diamondbacks, and he caught a line drive to the head. That is one of my earlier baseball memories. I can remember in the 90s when Michael Irvin, like, I don't know if he broke his neck or whatever it was, but I think it was against the Eagles. Like, I remember that. But I really remember, I'm talking about some of my earliest like big injury memories as a sports fan. This was the one for me in baseball. Billy Wagner taking that line drive to the head, them standing there around him for several minutes, and him ultimately having to be carted off the field. It was a concussion. He comes back from it. Everything's good. That's a blessing. But I remember that being the first time I was like really scared for a player after watching it or while watching a baseball game. But he came back from that. That was before the 99 season. I'm trying to remember if that was 97 or 98. I feel like it was 98. But he's got 99. And think about this. He finishes fourth in the – I didn't even realize this till the Astros put this out when they announced his induction. But he finished fourth in the Cy Young voting as a closer that year. 39 saves, struck out 124 across 74 and 2/3 inning. Gave up just 35 hits and had a 1.57 ERA. At the time, apparently, his opponent batting average, and we didn't really talk. I want to point this out. Like back then, at least I didn't. We didn't really talk much about opponent batting average and strikeouts per nine. At least I don't remember that being like just a huge focal point back in 1999. But his opponent batting average and his strikeouts per nine were the best in Major League history for a single season up until that point. And then apparently his whip was another stat that I did not cite back in 1999, of course, as a 10-year-old. But his whip was also historic, fourth best for a single season up until that point. So we're talking about someone in Billy Wagner who was steady over a number of years and then authored one of the best seasons that we've seen from any pitcher in a single season. And I was 10 years old. I didn't really understand what I was watching at the time or the weight of it, but I knew that Billy Wagner was damn good. I knew that much. So shout out to him. Shout out to him. Salute to Billy Wagner and congratulations on finally making it to the Hall of Fame. It's well deserved. And I also point this out before I get out of here. Like I feel like closers, especially the way that the game is going and the way that the game is being managed today, I feel like closers are easy to overlook and easy to minimize. We honestly don't really talk about them after they retire. Like other than Mariano Rivera, we don't talk much about closers after they're done closing, after their careers are over. So I think it's cool from that perspective when one of those guys is acknowledged in this way, even if it takes longer than you wanted it to. This is his, I believe, his 10th year, final year on the ballot, and he finally gets in. And I know this because since I've been in the media over the past 5 years, every year I could remember the politicking to get Wagner in, and me always being like, I don't see what the big deal is. It's a no-brainer. He's one of the best closers I ever seen. Put him in. What are we talking about? But it wasn't happening. So I'm very happy for Billy Wagner and to be talking about the brilliance of a closer, him specifically. And the closer, again, just honestly not the same concept I feel like it was when Wagner pitched and when a lot of us grew up watching baseball. So cool moment. That class in and of itself is obviously Ichiro. I should mention Ichiro and CC Sabathia also headline this class. They are a part of my era of watching baseball as a young person as well. So I'm glad to see them in. Gonna have fun with this Hall of Fame class. And again, Billy Wagner, not that I got tired of the politicking every year for him, because I always agreed with the position that he should be in. But I am certainly glad that by the end of it, better late than never, that he finally has been acknowledged and properly so. So that's it for this edition, this episode of the B Block Podcast. Make sure that you are subscribed, that you are rating, that you are reviewing, and go ahead and tell a friend about the podcast as well. That'll help us out a great deal. And until next time, man, y'all be good.